Legality is a beast, the Leviathan's strongest weapon, but it hides in plain sight. Leveraged with malicious intent, its consequences are devastating. We will see how Hitler was able to use legality to rise to power. We will also see how legality made Donald Trump fall. Imagine the following: you get pulled over for speeding, stop your vehicle, talk with the officer and finally pay a fine. Obviously you didn't want to do this, probably you see the fine as being unfair because you didn't harm anybody, or you assume that the speeding limit you violated is too strict. Perhaps even you deem the system to be illegitimate altogether. However, in any case you pay because you were ordered to do so by a state official. That's the power of legality. Legality is the perception that something is legal. When is something legal? If it stems from a source that most people see as the source of the law being a set of rules they know that they have to follow. Even if you are perfectly fine violating a law for whatever reason, you know that you have done something illegal, something that may have consequences. You get that feeling in your gut that you have done something wrong. Moreover, you cannot expect your peers to sympathize with your deed, they rather perceive you as a violator or even a criminal. Even if they feel that the law is unjust and feel pity for you, they accept the consequences bestowed on you nonetheless. This, however, can be advantageous. Whoever is able to justify his acts by reference to the law, or even better, is able to use the mechanism of legality to create new laws or change existing ones, can use this perception for his own ends. Moreover, the changed law is enforced by the state itself, by existing structures. The enforcement is done by humans who are under the perception of legality as well. A police officer will enforce a law he personally sees as unjust because it's his job and that is what his peers expect from him. People are used to follow orders by police and won't resist either. Legality is probably the most important justification, if not the only justification, liberal democracy can muster in a multicultural and pluralistic society. Therefore, everything is accepted as law that has come to fruition by a process that the denizens of a certain state accept as lawmaking. In Western democracies, this usually involves a representative parliament that votes certain laws in existence. Its members ought to be elected by a fair election. These laws are laws because parliament voted on them, or to be more specific, they have been brought forth by a government that people see without differentiation as the source of law. Obviously, liberal democracies have mechanisms to control the validity of laws and to prevent abuse. There are constitutional courts, there are provisions on the necessary majorities in parliaments. Some protections are hardwired in the constitution itself. The Weimar Republic, the democratic government of post-World War I Germany, had such protections as well. The Constitution of 1919 features a broad catalogue of fundamental human rights, like freedom of speech, the right to assemble, religious freedom, etc. The government was constructed around a parliament consisting of democratically elected representatives of different parties. But the Nazis were able to use the exact mechanisms of legality to bring down this democratic framework. In the beginning of 1933, Weimar Germany has been governed by 3 different governments within 3 years. It has become impossible to form a stable government, since Parliament, responsible for making the Chancellor as head of the government, was deeply partitioned into a host of different parties, including the National Socialist Party and the German Communist Party. Not being able, or the later parties not willing, to find a compromise, Parliament had rendered itself useless. This obviously brought the mechanisms of legality to a halt, all the while the raging economic crisis that had started with the Black Thursday of 1929 demanded immediate action. Since 1930, the executive branch of the government ruled by so-called emergency decrees to alleviate the situation. These decrees, albeit routed in the now infamous Article 48 of the Weimar Constitution, were perceived as at least not being as legal as acts of parliament, especially since they have not been brought forth by somebody with the backing of parliament. This was a conundrum, since the need for the emergency decrees has arisen by the failure of the parliament in the first place. The leader of the party that could boost the most representatives in parliament, although not able to command a majority, started to market himself as a way back to legality. Because a chancellor backed by a meaningful part of parliament is still better than somebody backed by nobody. Hesitantly, other parties started to support Adolf Hitler's proposed chancellorship as well. Finally, on the 13th of January 1933, Adolf Hitler took office. Hitler never had held back about his plan to transform the democratic Weimar Republic into Nazi Germany after taking office. Parliament bestowed on him basically unlimited power with the Enabling Act in March 1933. Using these powers, Hitler put this plan into action. This plan, however, was seen as legal because it was based on an act of parliament. Enabling acts like the one of 1943 have been passed for earlier governments, albeit with a far more limited scope. Everybody knew that the Nazi government will end the democratic constitutional system of Weimar, but everybody accepted it. Not only did Germans submit to the new systems, also foreign states accepted the new government without any hesitancy. That's the power of legality. As we have seen, it's about perception. As long as you can make your acts look legal, you can do basically everything and use the state's means to enforce it too. Even better, the majority of the denizens of said state will accept this enforcement because they are used to obey the very same officers and institutions, even when they feel that the measure in question is unjust. This obviously puts you in a way better situation than somebody who is doing the revolution the classic way by destroying the old system and replacing it with a new one. Think of the struggles such revolutions like the American, the French or Russian have had to secure their power. Hitler had the ability to make his acts look legal by employing means perceived as legal, even though his acts were literally ripping apart the fabric of the liberal constitution of Weimar and finally opened the way to the Nazis' rule of terror. The Nazis took this approach very seriously and would always base their acts at least superficially legally on the Weimar Constitution and its now meaningless institutions. They consciously avoided any notion that they have overthrown the Weimar Republic or instituted a new constitution, even though they de facto did not adhere to the Weimar Constitution anymore, and committed horrendous atrocities. Everything is possible when the Enabling Act allows you to pass laws that can change the constitution without limits. Since the Enabling Act was indeed subject to a time limit, the Nazis would repeatedly prolong it, even as Hitler's rule was literally uncontested and parliament hasn't been in session for years. Hitler just signed the renewal himself to keep the vial of legality. How to pull off such a legal revolution? Violate the constitution by employing the constitution itself, place formalities up front while you slit the throat of your enemies and abuse human rights from the back. People usually would rather look at the source of an act than on its lawfulness, will later perhaps only be determinable by a lawyer. When they start to realize that things go south, you should be firmly invested in your power. Therefore, as long as you control the source, you control legality. It brings us to the promised last part, Trump. Trump was originally in an interesting position for a legal revolution, since the president is one of the most vital parts of the government of the United States, and can leverage his power to create executive orders. However, his tenure is limited to the next election. The perception of legality fades if a president wants to prolong his tenure beyond the next election without being re-elected. Since the election is the core justification of any democratic government and basically the starting point of the mechanism of legality, the obvious angle of attack for any legal revolution would be here. The Nazis made sure that an election couldn't harm them, but Trump did not. Trump had to learn the efficacy of legality the hard way, even though it was lawfulness for a sitting president to contest the results of an election occurred. These acts were perceived as an attack on legality itself. Trump had to rely on his charisma to justify his actions, which finally didn't come through. His enemies could play the game of legality, while Trump couldn't, for better or worse. Thanks for watching to the end. You are honoring my work by doing so, which humbles me. Thank you. This is my first video. Critique is highly appreciated. On this channel I want to discuss the mechanisms to run the greatest machine known to mankind, the state. These topics are highly controversial and probably cannot be dealt with in a short video. I do not want to offend anybody. But if you feel offended nonetheless, down below is the comment section, I guess. If you are interested in more, like and subscribe.